It's our great pleasure to introduce today to Mr. Sean Greene. He's Associate Administrator for Investment and Special Advisor for Innovation for Small Business Administration in the U.S. The keynote today, the conference today, has as a title, Building a Sustainable Economic Model for the Entrepreneur, Lessons Learned in the U.S. So Sean is responsible for both the Small Business Investment Company program as well as the Small Business Investment Research. He also leads the SBA's efforts focused on stimulating highgrowth entrepreneurship and has been one of the leaders in the administration's Startup America initiative. At the end of the conference, he can explain a little bit what this initiative is about. Sean brings more than 20 years of experience as an entrepreneur, investor, and business strategist to the Small Business Administration in the United States. And he will be presenting some of the key elements on the funding ecosystem for the early stage entrepreneur in the US. He will bring some examples of a successful government policy introduced to support the entrepreneur, examples of a not successful policy introduced, and finally a discussion of Startup America. Sean's idea is to talk for 20 minutes approx, and then to open for questions and a possible debate. Okay? Thank you, Sean. You can say.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Es un placer total estar con ustedes. I had planned to do the entire lecture in Spanish, but then when I found out it was on video, I got too nervous, so I'm going to switch to English. So what I thought I would do, again, was spend 20 minutes talking about a range of things that are happening in the US, and then when I've been in the audience, I hate when people just talk forever and like to have more interaction. So I would like to dedicate more of the time to questions and interactive. Now, I heard that you may be shy initially with questions, so I'd ask you to start thinking about questions now, so that way we can have a robust conversation. And what I thought I would talk about is first just talk a little bit about my background and how I came into entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship policy. Secondly, talk about the Startup America initiative and the range of things that are happening both within the US government as well as in the private sector in the US, and where there are potential opportunities to learn for that for Spain. But then third, direct more questions to you individually as you're looking at the potential to be entrepreneurs, what lessons learned that I've seen both as an individual and from working with lots of entrepreneurs about the challenges and the rich opportunities that entrepreneurship creates. So just by way of background, again, I've been in the administration of President Obama for the last 2 years working on entrepreneurship policy, but I've been in the private sector for 20 years. So originally I had come out of business school and worked with McKinsey and Company. I'm sure many of you know that, or know the firm. I left there to become an entrepreneur, and as I like to describe it to people, when I was at McKinsey, I was getting paid a lot of money to tell other people what to do. And so then I decided to become an entrepreneur in which I was getting paid very little money and I had to do all the work myself, right? So an interesting set of challenges. That being said, it was one of the best decisions in my life. So I created an online travel company. This was in the late 90s, so before the internet bubble really had hit, but it was kind of before that, an internet travel company called Away.com. And the focus was to bring the travel industry online. Now, I started that company because I had a passion. I've lived all over the world. I have a passion for travel. And I had this silly idea that if I started a travel company, I'd get to take all these great vacations. Well, as an entrepreneur, I was working too hard for the first 5 years. I didn't take a single vacation. So you should question my judgment in anything that I had to say. But long story short, you know, that was a dizzying time to be an entrepreneur as the internet was taking off and we had the roller coaster ride, that I made every mistake known to man and entrepreneurs. I think fortunately one of the things my team and I did was end the mistakes a little bit faster and learn from them and shift and pivot so that we could recognize when we did make a mistake, get the customer feedback and change. And I'll come back to that notion of pivoting later when I talk about lessons learned for entrepreneurships. But anyway, all's well that ended well with that particular company. I wound up selling it to Orbitz which you probably know is one of the largest online travel agencies in the world. And an interesting moment, by the way, in my entrepreneurial journey, prior to selling to Orbitz, several years before that, I was looking to do a business partnership with them. And at that time, the trend was for the small companies to pay lots of money to the big companies to get a section of their website and to get the traffic from the big company. And I was in the middle of a negotiation with Orbitz about that, in which they were asking me to pay them $500,000 to have the privilege of being on their site. And in the middle of the meeting, I changed the conversation and said, actually, you should be paying money to be on my site, because our site focused on adventure travel and this high niche travel in which people would be researching a trip to go whitewater rafting in Costa Rica or in safari in Africa or whatever. And I said to them, those are precisely the people who are most likely to buy airline tickets, et cetera, on Orbitz. So I walked out of that meeting, I walked into the meeting with them expecting me to pay them $500,000. And I walked out of the meeting with an agreement that they were actually going to pay me $500,000. And that was a fundamental evolution in the business model. And you know, literally the light bulb went off in the middle of that meeting, that actually at a time when internet craziness was at its peak, saying, hey, we have to come up with a sustainable business model with revenues, et cetera. And that's why we were able to survive through the chaos of the internet bubble and then ultimately have a successful exit. So I went from being an entrepreneur, and that's a case of a successful company. I've also created companies that didn't succeed. And I think one true mark of the entrepreneur is a willingness to acknowledge that sometimes you will fail, and that's okay. There are lessons to be learned in failure. To then becoming an investor. And so I, with a business partner, created a fund to invest in other entrepreneurs, all in the online mobile space, and wound up investing in several dozen other entrepreneurs. And then finally had an opportunity to join the Obama administration. I had no plans to go into the federal government, but there was a unique moment in time. I already lived in Washington, so that was easy. But also a fundamental belief that what I'm doing now is a logical extension of my passion for entrepreneurship. So I've gone from being an entrepreneur to investing in entrepreneurs to now working on entrepreneurship policy. And particularly in the US, as well as I would argue Spain, the moment that we're in right now in terms of the economic crisis, entrepreneurship is needed now more than ever. And so fundamentally, I believe in whatever job you're doing, you do it because you want to have impact, and the opportunity to join the government to have impact on entrepreneurship was great right now. So I jumped into that. I'll come back to this point later, but of all the jobs that I've had, without a doubt, the most satisfying to me personally has been being the entrepreneur. Taking something that started with an idea in my head, and literally when I started the company, we took a room in my house, that became the office. My wife got pregnant with our first child. She said, that office is going to be a room for the baby, go get a real office. So I went out, I went to friends and family, put in initial money myself, raised a little bit of money, wound up raising more venture capital. So, the evolution just took off in what it was. But of all the different career positions I've had, that has certainly been the most satisfying. So let me go back to a little bit about what we're doing now in the US to focus on entrepreneurship. So within the Small Business Administration is the official US government agency that helps small businesses. So I'm working within the SBA. My portfolio includes investment and innovation programs. So there are a couple of large multi-billion-dollar programs. Again, as an entrepreneur coming in, my first reaction is, wow, there are a lot more zeros at the end of everything when you're working in the government than I'm used to coming from a small company. But fundamentally, I'm focusing on helping high-growth entrepreneurship across the country. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at the numbers, half of all the jobs in the US are in small businesses. Now, generally, we define small businesses as 500 employees and less. So that's probably more of an SME definition in Europe. But not only are there a lot of jobs there, But when you're looking at new jobs that created in the economy, multiple academic studies show that it's all as a result of small businesses. So the bulk of net new jobs created in the US economy come from small businesses, but it's also disproportionately concentrated that there are a small number of firms who create most of the jobs. And in particular, it's young firms, brand new startups, and then companies, in the first 5 years of life who create all the net new jobs in the economy. So from a policy perspective, we're saying we have to be doing everything that we can to help entrepreneurship. Now, the fact that I'm here in Spain, my sense is there's a high level of interest, both from the government as well as from the private sector, to be saying, what can we learn from the US to tackle issues and stimulate more entrepreneurship in Spain? Now, in the US, even though to the rest of the world often it looks like the paragon of entrepreneurship, we still see meaningful challenges. So since the financial crisis, the number of new companies being started has dropped by more than 25% each year. So we've lost 150,000 new startups each year. As a result of that, we've lost 1.8 million jobs. And so we've said, look, now more than ever, we need to help these startups and young companies. And in particular, we need to differentiate that somebody who wants to create a restaurant has a different set of needs than somebody who is starting as a small company, but ultimately has the ambition to be a large company. And so we launched the Startup America effort, which basically was a view that, hey, this isn't just the Small Business Administration. The entire US government has to say, how can we do everything that we can to help these entrepreneurs? And just as importantly, and probably more importantly, we need to mobilize the private sector and universities to help these entrepreneurs as well. So I won't give you all the long details of all the different policies, but just some highlights. So there are a bunch of government programs that already help entrepreneurs. A lot of them focus on capital, whether it's lending or the Small Business Investment Company program that I mentioned, which is a fund of funds. Private capital going into funds, we match it. This is a program that's been around for 50 years. It is invested in companies like Federal Express and Intel and Apple. But it had become slow and a bit bureaucratic. So we've slashed red tape by 70%. We've improved our processing times by 70%. And as a result, we got more capital out to these funds who are investing in small businesses than at any point in the 50-year history of the program. So we can take existing programs, make them a lot more efficient. A big opportunity we're focusing on in the US is how do we celebrate entrepreneurship more? Because again, I understand that from Spain, you say, oh, you already do a good job within the US. Within the US, we feel we don't celebrate it enough. So how can we get the president? Because when President Obama speaks, people pay attention. So how do we invite entrepreneurs to the White House? When the president is on the road visiting different communities, let's make sure he visits a small business or an entrepreneur. So doing a lot of that. Third, we're very focused on reducing barriers to entrepreneurship. So saying, what are things that are getting in the way of entrepreneurs? So one example of this is that processing times. For small businesses, time is money. The US federal government doesn't think in that way. So how can we get the government to think about shortening times? How do we make it, a big problem we've seen in the US government is that there are many, many different programs to help small businesses, but they're impossibly complicated to navigate, and you don't know which agency. So how can we leverage technology to help entrepreneurs find the program that's right for them very, very easily? And we've launched an effort called businessusa.gov to do that. So anyway, I won't go through every detail, but a lot of efforts to reduce barriers, a lot of efforts to make the federal government more transparent and release data to let entrepreneurs build off this. And so one example I've been talking to others about is people don't know the GPS industry in the US basically started because they had federal government data from the Department of Defense that they said, let's release this on an open basis that any entrepreneur can come and build applications on top of that. And as a result of just opening that up, not a big program, just open up the data, a multi-billion-dollar industry has been created. So there are many things the government can do that aren't always about spending money to fuel the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So at the same time, the government's doing some good things, or hopefully good things. We've said we have to mobilize the private sector because that's the real agent for change. And so as part of Startup America, we work with some key individuals to create something called the Startup America Partnership. And the idea of the partnership is it's a nonprofit organization, not affiliated with the US government, and their mission is to mobilize private sector resources to help entrepreneurs. And so the board is populated by great former entrepreneurs that includes Steve Case, who founded AOL, Michael Dell, who founded Dell Computer, Fred Smith, who founded Federal Express. By the way, a great story on Federal Express, and I don't know if it's a fact or an urban legend, but that Fred Smith submitted the idea for, it's a fact, confirmed. Right. Fantastic, that he submitted this as his senior thesis while in college and got a horrible grade because the idea for Federal Express, he submitted it while he was in school and he got a horrible grade and the professor said, this will never work. Well, evidently it works quite well. So don't be discouraged by any of the grades that you get from any of your individual professors. That's the lesson learned. So these serial and successful entrepreneurs have come in to say, let's mobilize the private sector. They have done things like get more than $1 billion of commitments from companies like Google and American Express and Microsoft, et cetera, to directly help entrepreneurs. They've done things like go to Fortune 500 companies like IBM and said, hey, how can you make it easier for small businesses to sell to you? Because having a large business as a customer can be just as important as having investment capital. And so we're off to the races there. And in some cases, these are national commitments. In other cases, they're focused very much at the regional and local level. And what we see in the States is there are so many different organizations at the local level doing great things. Many of these are universities. And so you hear a lot about what's happening at MIT or what's happening at Stanford, and great things are happening at those universities. But what we also see is great things are happening at many other universities as well. And so one of the efforts is how can we get the private sector to fund taking these successful programs to the next level. And I think there are really interesting and important opportunities to do that. So that's happening on the private sector. I think coming back to you as individuals, and you're coming to a point soon where you'll have to make decisions about what you want to do next. I heard a data point that 60+% of young people in Spain say their preferred choice of career is with the government. So I have served in the government, and I'm proud to serve in the government. Let me make a strong recommendation to become an entrepreneur instead. And I think a few perspectives on why, and then some more concrete advice on how. For me personally, it comes down to passion, right? So I've had, again, a wonderful set of opportunities in front of me. No matter where I have been, as my wife will testify, I'm a workaholic and I tend to work too much and get highly engaged. But part of that is because I've been fortunate to, whatever I'm doing, to be passionate about it. And at the end of the day, when you're looking for satisfaction in your career, being passionate about whatever you choose to do, I think fundamentally matters. And it's far easier to be passionate about something when you're building and creating than in almost any other career that I can think of. Certainly teaching other things, you can have that same kind of passion. But to me, that building and creation is tremendously important. And advice that someone gave to me early on in my career is, think forward to what is going to be said, at your funeral. What is it that you want people to say about you? What's the impact that you want to leave behind? And certainly that matters in things like family, et cetera. But professionally, what's the impact? So I can talk about in my travel company, which I started, as a wacky idea and this belief that, hey, this medium, the internet, created a new opportunity to help people plan travel. But when I left it, 3 million people were using it to plan vacations every month. And in the US, they say that the average person spends more time planning their annual vacation than they do researching the purchase of a home. So, using this medium to do that is satisfying. By the way, one of our tricks, we would send an email postcard every day that was just a beautiful photo of a beach or whatever. And with email, you can track precisely how many people open it and when they do. The highest traffic on that email was on Wednesday at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, because everybody's in the office and they want to be thinking about the next vacation rather than so I contributed to the destruction of productivity in the American economy. So I feel bad about that now as a government employee. But that impact, to say 3 million people are now using this to plan great vacations, to this day I feel fundamentally proud of, and so on. And being an entrepreneur, you have that impact. So some more concrete, insights on how to do it. So first thought is, just in my 1 day in Spain so far, I'm hearing a lot about the challenges of being an entrepreneur in Spain, and it seems to me that there are significant challenges. Interestingly, though, when I travel around the U.S., I hear over and over again about the challenges of being an entrepreneur in the U.S. And particularly for those who aren't in Silicon Valley, right? So yes, Silicon Valley is, or Cambridge, but most people in the US say, well, how are we, we don't have what Silicon Valley has, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm seeing entrepreneurs flourish all across the country, not just in those places, despite a set of challenges that in some ways, you don't have the success stories, you don't have the mentors, the venture capital industry isn't the same. So the challenges are real and great. The challenges just of being an entrepreneur anyway are real and great because the odds are stacked against you. But that doesn't mean there isn't a meaningful opportunity. A couple of concrete lessons. First is focus on solving a problem for someone, right? So that problem can be for consumers writ large, it can be for a business, but have a laser focus on what is the problem that you're solving for them, and communicate, very much. So don't start with a great idea, in a vacuum. It's all about what problem, who's the potential customer, what problem that you're solving. For those of you who haven't seen this, I'd strongly recommend a movement that's getting a lot of momentum in the States called Lean Startup. There's literally a book, but there's a website, there's a broader, Eric Ries, R-I-E-S, is the entrepreneur who's led this. And it's a great philosophy, not just lean in terms of keeping costs low, that's part of it, but lean much more about this mindset of you as an entrepreneur have to connect with customers and have an ongoing iterative relationship of how you're modifying your value proposition to serve those customers, whoever those customers will be. And proving your concept, growing with your customers is fundamentally important. So one is that kind of relentless focus on customer. Secondly, as it relates to investors, investors are obviously important. I think one of the mistakes I've seen many companies make in the US, particularly during the internet bubble, was they looked at their investors as their customers, right? And so they did way too many things trying to satisfy their investors rather than saying, at the end of the day, it's the customers who matter first and foremost. So venture capital, et cetera, important. It's a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself. Third practical lesson, I think, is that notion of the right balance between passion and having a goal and a vision, and the constancy of that goal, but the critical importance of flexibility and adaptability. No business plan is right at the beginning. Things will change. Now, what changes? I don't know. But that example that I talked about with Orbitz, that was literally a fundamental change in the pivot of the economic model that we saw as a company. Now, not only did that create revenue in the short term, it ultimately led to Orbitz wanting to buy us at the end. But that notion of saying, hey, you've got to be adaptable and flexible, critically important. Then final point is you are the message, right? So don't get lost in the fancy PowerPoint. Don't get lost in the detailed Excel spreadsheet with financial models. You as the entrepreneur are the message. So it's your passion, it's your belief that fundamentally will drive the business. First and foremost, you'll be a salesperson in chief, whether that's selling customers, whether that's selling investors, whether that's attracting people to the team, right? So when I first started, attracting people from, just because I was crazy enough to leave McKinsey and do it, didn't mean everybody else was. And this was pre-internet bubble before everybody was going to this. So it's hard to attract other team members to a startup company, and we talked about yesterday, people's parents saying, what are you doing? You're crazy. You've got a good job, etc. They will say that. They say that in the US. My parents, when I was a management consultant, didn't understand that. When I wanted to be an entrepreneur, they didn't understand that. When I was investing, they didn't understand that. Now I work for President Obama. My mother's really happy, right? But you can't let that, deter. But other people are going to think about. But you, the passion, your vision, is a fundamental part to bringing the team together. So you are the message is a fundamental piece of it. And then the final part is, failure is part of what will happen. And I know, again, people raise the same question in Spain. Failure is treated differently than in the US. But again, in the US, it's not one monolithic country, although sometimes it may appear that way. Silicon Valley is very different than Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has a very conservative culture, right? So I was an entrepreneur in Washington, D.C. When I first moved there, when I looked, I saw the federal government, large international organizations like the IMF, and then a whole group of lawyers who would, just pay attention to. And so entrepreneurial ecosystem in DC was relatively new. So all those stigmas about fear of failure, et cetera, were very much real there. And so you're not going to make that go away overnight. But learning from failure, and one of the best experiences I ever had was sitting around with senior people from Google and Facebook. And the session that we had, and it was part of a little conference, was, what was your biggest failure? And so I knew many times that I had screwed up. But to hear people from Google talk about the change in the search algorithm that, affected millions and millions of searches in a single day, right? And hearing that over and over again. So that's, that's okay. It's part of it. How do you learn from failure and adapt really matters. So those are just some of the practical lessons that I wanted to impart to you individually as entrepreneurs. So let me do this. Let me stop kind of talking. As I said, I don't want to talk too long, and really turn it more to an interactive dialogue. I know you've all been thinking hard about insightful and penetrating questions to ask. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. We've been hearing you talking about how failure should be not demonized, as it happens here in Spain, which usually parents advise you to become public servant rather than having your own idea just in case you will not succeed. So I would like to know what advice would you give us to build a culture around risk, as we can see in the United States, which is you're not risk adverse, you're favoring risk, and failure is not a drawback. So what would you advise that we can build here this culture around risk? What first steps should we be taking? Thank you.
So let me answer that question in two parts, right? So one part is a cultural change for the country as a whole. That obviously doesn't happen overnight. But then there's separate, what can each of you do individually, right? So let me tackle the first part. So there is no easy solution. That's a broad question. I think, though, when we were talking about things like celebrating entrepreneurship, having high-profile people who have been successful not only talk about the success, but talk about their failures as well, helps make it real to people that that's okay. That's part of being a successful entrepreneur. Sessions like the one I described, in which successful companies give concrete examples of things that have gone wrong, are part way to how you can start addressing that. From an individual perspective, I think there's a great mantra in the US, which is in the startup culture and in the lean startup culture, is fail fast and fail cheap, right? So I think part of the internet bubble was people putting 10, 20, $50 million bets and then doing things without that kind of customer feedback loop. So this mindset of try multiple things, it's okay, they won't all work out, but do it fast, learn the lesson, and then move on. That's something within your control as entrepreneurs. The other thing is that same kind of sharing you can do and lessons learned within a smaller community of entrepreneurs and startups, and whether it's alumni from the school who've been successful or people within the program. How do you share in that ecosystem? So as you're looking to change the broader, how do you have a meaningful increase in entrepreneurship in Spain, I would say, don't you guys worry about that broader cultural change. Let's get the government, the private sector organizations, and we just came from a great event organized by Accenture and the Innovation Foundation from Bank Inter, in which large corporations are trying to do this. But don't change them yet, just change yourselves. How do you get more students coming out of your program to launch companies? That's something that's within your control and working on both parallel paths.
My question is about your corporate experience. You're not the first person that is encouraging us to become an entrepreneur, but however, not only you and the other speakers that we had, they all had before a corporate experience before becoming an entrepreneur. So how do you think this is this fundamental, this experience you had in the corporate world, or we should start away already as soon as possible?
Yeah, I don't think there's one path or the other. So I worked at McKinsey. I use a line that I don't know if it was Ben or Jerry. Do you know the ice cream Ben and Jerry's, right? I don't know if it was Ben or Jerry who used it, but they said they were unencumbered by the burden of prior experience, right? So what I found was when I became an entrepreneur, really not much of my experience at McKinsey was particularly relevant. Now, good critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, strategic thinking, yes. But it wasn't that I said, you know, I had clients in the travel industry and learned from my experience in the travel industry to do this. So I don't think in any way, shape, or form corporate experience is a precondition to being an entrepreneur. And look at many examples. Let's pick Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook as one extreme example. You know, zero corporate experience. And we see many companies being founded by people who have zero corporate experience whatsoever. There's still value very clearly, I think, from people who have deep industry knowledge or deep functional experience, who can then learn from that experience and say, I see a problem in the industry that I know very well, and I want to become an entrepreneur to do that. But honestly, my fundamental belief is the longer you're in a corporation, the harder it is to then become an entrepreneur. Both because you're giving up more, right? You've got a salary, you've got et cetera, as well as you become dependent on a broad set of other resources who do things for you. When you're an entrepreneur, you have to do it all yourself. And in some ways, it's easier when you're starting fresh to say, I don't know what all that, you know, how it's done in the corporation. I want to do it lean and mean.
In the US, how do you support entrepreneurs on financing? So especially after the financial crisis, a lot of problems to get money. What are you doing that basically entrepreneurs get money from the banks or whoever?
Yeah, so we're doing everything that we can, and then some. So big challenge in the US, and again, I understand it's a challenge here. What we're seeing is traditionally, one of the big focus from the federal government was on bank lending, right? So the SBA has big programs, other organizations have programs that help banks lend to small businesses who the banks, they came close to making a loan, but not quite. And so incentives are given to banks. In the economic downturn, banks have really stopped small business lending, and we've done even more there. That being said, traditional bank lending is actually not the kind of capital that most startups need, or that most companies who have tremendous growth potential, because debt capital is either done lending against assets or lending against cash flow. Well, as a startup, you don't have assets, you don't have cash flow, right? So we've really been focused for the high growth entrepreneurial community on a different set of policies, particularly as it relates to equity markets. So first thing we've seen in the economic downturn is traditional sources of capital are way down. You know, borrowing against your credit card, borrowing against your home value, that's gone in the credit crisis. Angel investing, down by 30 to 40%. So for that part of the market, we focused on tax policies to give additional incentives to people who invest in these kind of businesses. We're looking at structural changes right now in terms of something called crowdfunding and literally there's a bill in Congress right now, and I've been working as part of the Securities and Exchange Commission Advisory Committee on Small Business Capital Formation to permit smaller capital raises, $50,000, et cetera, via a distributed platform that allows people to raise from many people. So those are two things that we're doing in the true earliest stages, seed capital. In terms of venture and growth capital, the programs that I mentioned before, the SBIC program, is very much focused on those markets. So what we found was, you know, I had authority to give up to $3 billion each year in this program. We were only doing $750 million, partly because we were too slow, we were too bureaucratic. So we've said, before we even ask Congress for anything new, let's just take advantage of this existing program. So as a result of turning the timelines down, we've gone from $750 million per year to $1.8 billion last year. So that's $1 billion of incremental capital. That's not going directly to entrepreneurs, but it goes into funds who then invest in entrepreneurs. Then the final part that we're working on is public offerings, which as a result of many factors, the number of companies who go public have dramatically decreased in the last 10 years. And while it's relatively few companies that will go public, the ability for companies to go public and investors to then get their money back is an incredibly important part of the ecosystem as a whole. So by working on statutory and regulatory changes about how the IPO market gets regulated, we hope that that will have impact on incenting investors at all stages that I described. So it literally is a all of the above strategy. And I think as I'm talking to people in Spain, you know, I would recommend the same set of, there's no one magic solution. You need a concentrated effort across all parts of the chain.
Just one more. Are there any institutions who actually help entrepreneurs, not just with money, but also with kind of supporting, consulting?
Absolutely. So when I was an investor, I would tell people that the money I brought was actually the least important part of the value that I could add. It was my experience, it was my network. And typically entrepreneurs would say, sure, just give me the money, right? And then a year or two later would say, actually, Sean, you were right. It was all those other things that mattered. We have been very lucky to see many, many organizations who are doing this kind of work, often affiliated with universities, but not exclusively with universities. And one great opportunity is mentorship. So the ability to mobilize successful business people to help mentor these young companies is incredibly important. And again, they could have industry knowledge, they could have general entrepreneurial experience, they could have functional experience in a particular discipline. And so we've seen many organizations, and I'm happy to share examples of that with you to take a look at, if you're looking to model or replicate things here, you know, so, and again, it's not just at MIT and Stanford. These are happening at universities all around the US.
Since you are working for a U.S. Government, I would like to know the situation of entrepreneurship in USA about renewable energies, and of course, if as a government you are helping and pushing this sector.
So absolutely. So a range of things. President Obama has made reducing our dependence on foreign oil a very large national priority, right? And so that includes energy efficiency and reducing our consumption, as well as increasing the availability of renewables and alternative sources of energy. So there's a range of things that are being done. I'll give you examples of some of those. First is starting with government as a customer, right? We didn't talk about this as much, right? But the US government buys a lot of things, right? $450 billion of expenditures by the US federal government. The Department of Defense uses 2% of all the energy consumed in the US. So the government as a customer can have massive potential impact on an emerging industry like clean energy. So we've seen things like the General Services Administration, which does all the service buying. 25% of hybrid cars in the US last year were actually sold to the US government versus GSA. So again, that's an initiative. Within the Department of Defense, major initiatives to say, how do we shift to more renewable energies, and some both in terms of what they're buying now, as well as using the installed base of US, so the Navy, for instance, has said they've got large bases. Let's make those as a test bed for innovative new technologies who need a customer to prove that their technology can work. Let's make Navy bases a test bed for that. So government as a customer can be a meaningful opportunity. Secondly, just in terms of pure investment in renewables companies, the Department of Energy has put in billions of dollars of investment across the board. There have been some of those that have gotten bad press, but across the board, there's a meaningful commitment that we need a higher level of investment. What we have seen working with the Department of Energy are taking targeted programs like this idea of mentorship. So to the previous question of what are organizations who are doing interesting work, we've seen business accelerators around the country doing great work to mentor clean energy entrepreneurs. So we actually funded a pilot program to help accelerate mentorship of clean energy entrepreneurs. Because it's a new industry, there aren't as many experienced entrepreneurs, right? So how can you take people from multiple industries who have some value to help clean energy entrepreneurs? Again, another example. And then finally, in terms of research and development, a major initiative. So how many people have heard of DARPA? So the Defense Advanced Research Project. So it's this little organization within the Department of Defense that has been doing innovative R&D for forever, actually it's post-Sputnik, so since '57. Out of DARPA and DARPA research came a little thing called the internet, right? So it was actually government-funded R&D from this organization that helped through pioneering breakthroughs to help things like the internet. Well, 2 years ago within the administration, we created that equivalent within the Department of Energy called ARPA-E, focusing on funding R&D for breakthrough technologies to say, how do we take solar, the cost of, so pick solar, right? Right now the cost of installation in the US at least is still too expensive relative to fossil fuels to make it economically viable for most people to want. So how can we take the cost of solar down by a factor of 5x to make it cost efficient? Well, let's be doing the R&D investing as well. So again, pretty much in all of the above strategy in that as well.
Is it working? Okay. You talked about experience in consulting and in business entrepreneurship. So what do you think maybe McKinsey can learn from entrepreneurs, or what is there still? Is there anything missing? What McKinsey can add more value, or like the way of consulting? Is there anything they could change or something else?
So first, I think McKinsey is a great organization, right? So, and it does many things well. By the way, you look at even coming out of McKinsey, there have been many entrepreneurs. There have been many organizations like the Corporate Executive Board, which again, I don't know how well it's known here in Spain, that created a different model of consulting, right? In which they said, instead of doing it on a one-off basis, let's have syndicated research. Let's learn best practices from all the clients and then charge an annual fee. So there are entrepreneurial opportunities to say, how can we do consulting better as well? But to be honest, more of my time right now is spent saying, how do we help the entrepreneurs, not how do we help McKinsey be more entrepreneurial, although those opportunities exist. No, but it's clearly a great company. And again, when I'm praising my experience in being an entrepreneur, that's not diminishing the other experience I've had, because it was a phenomenal experience for me as well.
Sorry, yeah, I just grabbed the micro. I was just wondering, I mean, you have been talking about the national initiatives within the US, but are there also more international initiatives planned or anything? Because I was just thinking, you know, maybe the US is not the motor for itself anymore. Maybe they need a bit more input from the outside as well. I mean, that would be the same for Europe. Maybe we're not any more strong enough to do it ourselves. Maybe we need the others to generate new ideas to overcome this crisis, or do I get it all wrong?
So a few thoughts. One is, I think, generally, as most of you know, the U.S. is not as good at being international as most other countries. So I think fundamentally there's plenty to keep us busy within our own borders, but we clearly are working in an increasingly global world, so it's critical for the U.S. And particularly, you know, let's start talking about specific industries. In clean energy, you know, the U.S. can learn far more from Europe right now, and from Spain in particular. And so things like transportation and infrastructure, I think the rail system, as an example, in Spain is slightly, you know, ahead of where the U.S. is. So I think that there's a fundamental belief that we can learn a lot. I think there's also a belief that part of the reason I'm here, because the embassy is committed to say, if there are lessons learned that we've learned to share, that's incredibly important as well. So I think part of the issue is that we're all so busy solving our own problems, but there's clearly a broad set of opportunities internationally as well.
But are there some efforts done, or not really?
Well, you know,
It's not a focus.
well, it depends, right? So clearly on things like exporting, there's a ton of initiatives within the U.S. to help U.S. entrepreneurs become better exporters. There's a specific set of initiatives to help companies who want to invest in the U.S. make it easier to invest. And so working with, and I know this is a priority for the ambassador to say, hey, not just for the very largest Spanish companies, but how do we make it easier for small and mid-sized companies in Spain to invest in the U.S., given that the market is big. So on discrete issues, there are many individual things being done. So part of it will depend on what particular issue that you're focused on. On things like IP and intellectual property, huge set of challenges on global IP protection, and a lot of work being done there as well.
Yes. Hi, I like to share and then ask a question. By the way, I also want to share with the colleagues here, I'm a 1978 EOI, then a graduate, then I went to Wharton Business School, then I went to Booz Allen, which is a competitor of McKinsey, then I became an entrepreneur. And yet Obama nor Rajoy have called me yet, so I'm still an entrepreneur. I want to share a couple of things, and I want to ask you a couple of questions. I have a very similar track record to you, but obviously on the other side of the ocean. frankly, I think entrepreneurship is oversold, and I want to start a movement of responsible entrepreneurship. I've been teaching, advising entrepreneurs in 60 countries with the World Bank and IDB and European funds. I've been an entrepreneur, started 3 companies myself, and frankly, I think we have to go back to what we call responsible entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship, you know, and enticing people to do, but know what they're doing, as opposed to just go and open your company and ask for venture funds, which is what a lot of professors, not you, say without having any clue of what is entrepreneurship. Let me just share my 11 years of entrepreneurship. I was in McKinsey in Booz Allen. I started a company which was in consulting. Now, why did I start a company in consulting? Because I bought the dream of being an entrepreneur, like you, I guess. I was educated in the US and in Spain, by the way, in La Complutense. And so, you know, I wanted to be an entrepreneur all my life. And consulting was a great place to start my skills. But I didn't think of anything better than starting another consulting company and try to match the giants and in a niche market, which is international development consulting. Then I started a training company to diversify because I thought it was, you know, complementary. It's, you know, less business cycle than consulting, which is ups and downs. I have to share 2 things. One, I didn't know why I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I want you to comment on that. Was I a lifestyle entrepreneur? Was I a survival entrepreneur? Or was I somebody who wanted to create something, which is another animal, not the entrepreneur, but something called a company that has its own life? So I want you to analyze those 3, because at the end, after 11 years, I've decided I was a lifestyle entrepreneur, not a real entrepreneur. What do I want to do? Is I want to keep my salary. Obviously, not the Booz Allen, you know, $200,000 a year salary, but I wanted to have a decent life. I had a wife, 2 kids, a mortgage. So, no, not really wanted to start an animal and spend all my life sweating until that animal grew and then get 100,000 K. I wanted to more or less keep my lifestyle. So I wanted you to comment on that because that's important. Number 2, business cycles. I just couldn't believe when my $200,000 training company in 2009 went from 200,000 to 0 in Spain. Okay, I mean, I don't think you had that dramatic fall down in, I mean, nobody paid. My clients with administrations, governments, ayuntamientos, chambers of commerce, ITEX, all the export companies, nobody had money. Nothing. Nobody paid. 0. I mean, even in my darkest dreams of El Corralito in Argentina and other, I couldn't believe that, you know, you just didn't get paid. There was no money whatsoever in the market. So I wanted and yet I did something right. I had another company to fall back, which was a consulting. So diversification of the entrepreneur is an important issue. The last issue that made me survive, and I want to share this and maybe you could comment, is I linked up with a consulting company in the US and I became a sort of franchisee, a licensee of them. Now that helped me maintain some cash flow in private sector because I was working for government mainly, you know, international governments. Thank God I had that license franchise, if you want to call it, from 10th Step, which is an Atlanta company in project management, because that allowed me, you know, because the other thing failed, that allowed me to have something. So maybe comment a little bit on the model of franchising, because frankly, you know, franchising and being in company with another set of entrepreneurs is the best thing that can happen to an entrepreneur, which, as you know, is a very, very lonely job. Thank you.
And so thank you. That was great. A few things: lifestyle versus high growth entrepreneur. So when people talk about lifestyle, what they generally mean, or lifestyle entrepreneur, what they generally mean is you're not looking to create the next Google or the next Facebook. You're looking to create a good-sized company that's stable, generates income, and you're in control of. That's great, right? And so I think a fundamental view, and when I was talking about innovative programs, one of the most innovative programs I've seen at the University of Miami, in which they put their entrepreneurship program in their career services department, rather than putting in one of the faculties, because they want to embed that message that creating a job is just as viable as getting a job, right? And so that really comes to individual aspirations and what you want to do. Now, the beauty of a lifestyle company is it can be profitable, et cetera, but for a lot of people, part of the value and beauty of being an entrepreneur is you're the boss, right? You have more control than you would of just being in a part of a bigger organization. Part of the challenge in the federal government for me is I've been used to being my own boss for a long time. And now I literally have a boss. When she asks for something, I jump. When Congress asks for something, I jump. When the White House asks for something, I jump. So I'm in great shape because I'm jumping around all the time. But I got a lot of bosses. A lifestyle business has that value. A different set of, and still all that same. You're building and creating something, but you should know going into it what your aspiration is. Is that what you're aspiring, or do you want to change the world? Right. Second thought was on responsible entrepreneurship. So there are two potential meanings of the word responsible. One is don't go into it blindly and just do crazy things. Do it in a professional and appropriate way. There's a broader trend that we're seeing in the US around social entrepreneurship and responsible entrepreneurship in that way, which is viewing that this isn't just about the finances, right? You're doing something to have an impact on a broader set of stakeholders. So in the clean energy world, that's having an impact on the environment, or it could be in the education sector, or it could be creating entrepreneurship in low-income communities. What I am seeing in the US right now is the interest among students in that kind of entrepreneurship is going through the roof. And I come back to, it's people's view of wanting to have impact, wanting to change the world, whether in a big way or in a very local way. And so I'm seeing a tremendous growth there. So then finally, on the franchise piece, let me make a broader point. If I were in your shoes in Spain, right? So entrepreneurship is all about taking all these different risks. Sometimes it's technology risk, sometimes it's education risk, sometimes it's execution risk. You've got a great idea. Can you execute in a cost-effective? Sometimes it's business cycle risk. By the way, I missed the last financial crisis, but I survived the roller coaster of the internet, right? And what I saw was, I'm in the global travel industry. First the internet bubble burst, right? Then the SARS epidemic. You guys probably don't even remember this, right? But the aviation flu stopped travel. Then the Iraq war in the US had a major impact on how people were traveling. So the business cycle there was tremendous. Again, it's a series of risks. So if I were in your shoes, any entrepreneur should be looking at ways to mitigate risk. I think there are interesting opportunities to say, where are there proven business models or proven ideas, maybe in the US, maybe somewhere else, that you could take to Spain? Doesn't have to be a franchise, although that's one vibe. So where are there proven business ideas to take here? Or similarly, where are there things working in Spain, and maybe it's in the clean energy world, to take to the US? So you're reducing the risk of whether it's technology, does the business model work? And I would say franchising is one example of that, but it doesn't have to be limited to franchising. And again, it's just a great way to take risk out of the equation. So I think we have time for one or two more questions? For one more question. No pressure. Got to be a good one.
Okay, hello. I would like to know if you have any special policy in order to stimulating new great ideas. Thank you.
No, I don't think so. But I'm open to any great ideas too of what we can do. I think from the federal government perspective, it's the great ideas aren't going to come from us, right? The great ideas are going to come from the entrepreneurs. And so what we want to do is cultivate an ecosystem by which people who have ideas can put them to work. Because in my experience, there's been no shortage of ideas. New ideas aren't the problem at all. I hear great ideas all the time. The problem is people then having the passion and the willingness to do all the hard work to turn that idea into something real. That's actually the primary barrier, not the idea itself.
Okay, so we ran out of time for more questions. Thank you guys for your questions. to end up this great speech, first, thank you, Sean, for being with us today. Thanks to the U.S. Embassy. Thank you, Ms. Nathan. And then a final message to the students. If anyone here is interested in setting up their own business, I insist on the concept of failure. Don't be afraid to fail, because as Sean said, it's really part of the game. So in case you're interested, just go for it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.